Yes. Thank you. Our final speaker in this session is Mark Farrow, travelling into unknown territory, the known, the unknown, and the unknowable. I don't know what you're going to say, Mark, but I really look forward to it.
Okay, yes. So earlier this year at the Biosemiotics annual gathering, I gave a presentation that was based on a paper published in Biosemiotics Journal last year. So in both, I made the case that discourse should be understood more broadly than in relation only to language. So in part one of this presentation, I will focus, I'll be giving an overview of that presentation, and in part two I will then focus on that aspect that gives this presentation its title, namely the known, unknown and unknowable. So in its broader interpretation, I make the case that discourse can be said to take place where any interactive mechanism creates meaning whose value is in some way justified. Subsequently, I speak of three very distinct mechanisms of environmental discourse that create three very, very different kinds of justified meaning. The first of these mechanisms is replication. I argue that the mechanism of replication facilitates a discourse between a replicating lineage and its environment. This discourse takes place over a generational timeline. One of the consequences of this generational discourse is that biochemical complexities tend to evolve that assimilate physical properties in qualitative terms and in terms that are relevant to the continued survival of their replicating lineage. In my paper, I provide a detailed exposition of what is meant by qualitative and relevant. One of the conclusions I draw is that due to a generational discourse, the biochemical assimilation of environmental particulars tends to evolve in a way that assigns a qualitative ascription whose merit or value is qualified by the relevance that those ascriptions might or might not have on an individual's changing needs and survival demands. In other words, I claim that replication is a mechanism of discourse that has led to a novel ontological category where physical properties such as electromagnetic waves, chemical signatures and vibrational frequencies have acquired nuanced and meaningful qualitative characterization in the biological. I am of the view that this qualitative ascription to the physical is foundational to the emergence and evolution of qualitative phenomenal content and addresses, if only in part, the so-called hard problem of consciousness. There is then an evolving meaningful correspondence between the physiologies of replicating life forms and the environment. One might say that this correspondence qualifies a particular class of knowledge about the environment that is qualitative in its construction. The second mechanism of discourse is initiated by neural networks. A neural network has the capability to rapidly weight and prioritize a creature's qualitative assimilations of the environment. This capability has the potential to set in play an assimilative, evaluative and behavioral feedback. In effect, neural mechanisms facilitate a constantly changing real-time evaluative discourse between the individual creature and its qualitatively assimilated environment. I propose that a real-time evaluative discourse has the effect of spatially and temporally delineating an individual creature's world. Time and space, as an experiential ontology, comes into existence for the first time in creatures whose neural mechanisms facilitate a real-time evaluative discourse with the environment. A qualitative spatial and temporal worldview thereby characterizes the subjective embedded perspective. This special status qualifies a unique spatial, temporal, and qualitative environmental correspondence. In this respect, it defines a particular class of knowledge about the environment that is phenomenal in construction. So, the third mechanism of discourse is cognitive in nature. Increasingly sophisticated cognitive capabilities tend to evolve because individuals with improved capabilities tend to be able to acquire increasingly qualified understandings of their relationship to their qualitative, spatial, and temporal world. There comes a point in evolution when cognitive sophistication is such that it leads to understandings that determine more formal, generalized principles about the individual and its environment. These principles, or proto-concepts, tend to evolve within the individual due to an ongoing introspective discourse. Consequently, following the acquisition of this level of cognitive sophistication, an individual begins to conceive that the spatio-temporal world exists in principle as a rule-bound, factual and objective certainty. The individual is thereby provoked into considering that if it conceives of the certainty of existence, then it too must exist to be doing the conceiving. This amounts to a subjective self-identification of the objective self. It is a self-identification that qualifies a belief in the knowledge of the individual's own existential being. This novel status qualifies a unique class of knowledge about the world that is conceptual in its construction. So what I've described is three categories of environmental discourse that give rise to three distinct classes of meaning. Each lead to a particular class of action through their environmental engagement. In the case of humans, innate dispositions, learnt and emotive habits, and rationale each generate distinctive and oftentimes conflicting calls to action. On such occasions, the individual is faced with dilemmas of the heart and of the head. How is the individual to decide which and what actions better serve its various interests? I'm going to move on to part 2 now, which addresses only the conceptual side of things. The first two are instrumental in making the conceptual happen. So they're very important, but I'm just going to be focusing on the conceptual now in part 2. What I want to do is focus more specifically on this third ontologically distinct category concerned with conceptually constructed knowledge. To have a conceptual interpretation of reality is to have concepts for those things that are considered known, concepts for those things that are considered unknown but knowable in principle, and concepts for things that are considered unknowable. As individuals, the notion of ourselves and our place in reality is predicated on the way we conceptualize these three elements. It is the conceptual stances each individual adopts to these that secures and perpetuates the individual's stable ideological stance towards its reality. In this diagram, we can think of the outer circle shown in red as that which encompasses an individual's ideological stance to reality. It encompasses the individual's conceptualization of their existential self, which includes all that is considered known, unknown, and unknowable. The red arrows indicate that conceptual flaws, doubts, and inconsistencies have the potential to disturb the individual's stable worldview. There is always the encroaching threat from doubt and uncertainty. And each zone also threatens to institute changes and adjustments to its neighboring zones. This slide illustrates the interconnected nature of the concepts within each zone. When, for example, a concept concerning the unknown becomes a concept integrated with the known, it compels a shift in the dynamics of the ideological stance. Typically, such alterations lead to minor perturbations and adjustments. Stability shifts and a new worldview equilibrium is acquired. The individual thinks about reality and communicates about that reality in a slightly different way. But we can consider that certain conceptual realignments may lead to more drastic perturbations and destabilizing shifts. There are many such examples in history where new ideas have destabilized the way people think about the known, unknown, or unknowable. Such shifts have posed a significant threat to the stable ideological stance of individuals, which is why such ideas have been met with passionate resistance. We can trace many fundamental conceptual shifts to the great thinkers of the past. As individuals, we also tend to adopt certain cultural affiliations, which might include our academic affiliations. We tend to put our trust, for instance, in such things as science and the scientific method, in the state and its institutions, in the considered norms of moral virtue, in religious belief, and so on. Such affiliations are attractive because they provide preformed ideological foundations that can underpin an individual's ideological stance. They also qualify a common unifying purpose and an expressive medium for the individuals within any given community. Adopting these foundational affiliations has the effect of deflecting the potency of conceptual fragilities and of minimizing the possibility of social exclusion. Unsurprisingly, individuals and their communities cherish these foundational affiliations. Inevitably, on occasion, conflicting ideologies clash. During the resulting major perturbations, individuals will go to great lengths to defend the integrity of their ideological position. They will do this because their ideological stance incorporates the essence of their existential identity. Importantly, an ideological stance is not a product of rational thought, which is where fuzzy logic's coming in. There need be no logical premises to the concepts that underpin an ideological position. Rather, what is key is the compulsion of individuals to find a way of maintaining conceptual equilibria and ideological stability. It is this need to maintain a stable ideological stance that inevitably promotes positions of bias. Such bias is blind to considered judgment, to tolerance, to creativity, and to common sense. A better strategy is to understand fully the dynamic nature of conceptual constructs. This requires mapping the main types of conceptual frameworks and to understand more fully the nature of their interconnectedness and dynamic relationships and influences. This mapping has the potential to transform the way we interact, both as individuals and as communities within our communities and across communities. It would enable us to find novel solutions to the destabilizing effects of conceptual and cultural adjustment. It would facilitate creative discourse, improve our sense of value and judgment, and to found new systems of integrative understanding. Thank you. Any questions?